A very good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our second webinar in the Inspire series. Today, we will be moving slightly away from the education-specific lens to look into how the current realities around us have affected our social purpose organizations and operations. If there is one thing that the COVID situation has taught us, it's that uncertainties are always waiting around the corner and jump up in front of us, taking us by surprise. It is no doubt that for many of our organizations, this time has forced and even encouraged us to rethink, pivot, and hinge on opportunities that could keep our interventions going. But there is always more that we can do to stay prepared and ready for any uncertainty such as this that may come up in the future. Today's webinar is to instill the importance of strategizing for an uncertain future as social entrepreneurs take their organizations to greater heights. And with this, I would like to introduce our guest for the evening, Ms. Shruti Shibulal. Shruti is the CEO and Director of Tamara Leisure Experiences, a hospitality group built on a foundation of responsible and memorable hospitality. Shruti believes that a new way of working is possible, one that combines business performance with sustainability and respect for the community and environment. Every one of TLE's properties is designed, built, and operated with a conscious emphasis on sustainability. This includes mindful construction, reducing consumption, and recycling at every opportunity. TLE's properties also engage with and support local communities in multiple ways. Shruti is an alumnus of prestigious institutions like Columbia Business School and Haverford College, both in the USA. Shruti was named a Young Global Leader in 2017 by the World Economic Forum. As a trustee of the foundations which form the Shibulal Family Philanthropic Initiatives, she is deeply involved with several social purpose organizations focused on education. Thank you for joining us this evening, Shruti. And we would love to hear a little bit about your journey from you. A lot has been said about how your venture was able to thrive in this period when many were witnessing an unprecedented loss. What kind of strategy did you employ and how was your venture able to pivot itself to minimize negative impact? We'd love to hear all about it from you. Over to you, Shruti.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, it's so fun. This is such a fun experience for me, actually. I've known some of you from Mantra and Edumentum for some time, and I really would like to thank you all for inviting me to this. It's such a, it's a really fun opportunity for me. So thank you so much. I think, Deepika, you mentioned striving in the time of crisis, and I think it's very much a matter of perspective. I don't think from a business perspective any of us are striving right now. I think it's a really difficult time. It's a painful time, to be honest. If you just think about what, the kind of the larger impact of this crisis, it's quite scary. And, the only thing that we've been able to do, I think, in Tamara is, what we've been able to do is sort of refocus our attention from the stuff which is a bit depressing by some, maybe wise financial decisions and refocusing on the positive of the crisis, Some of the things that we've been trying to do during this time is really kind of focus on some of the foundational aspects of our organization. Things like, tedious things like documentation, doing some of the things that we had hoped to for a long time but was never able to really pay attention to, like going paperless. That was something that we had wanted to do for a long time. And so, it's certainly a matter of perspective. I really wouldn't say that we are striving right now. It is a difficult time. I think it's also been, the thing is with our business is that it is about people, right? Hospitality, finally, yes, we have buildings and, we run these buildings, but finally, our greatest assets are our people. And I think the most challenging and interesting part of this entire crisis has been for us, how do you ensure that your people are fundamentally okay? right? How do you ensure that they have this feeling of job security, which is so important when there is chaos sort of circling around you? What is the kind of security that you are able to give them? So we've been focusing a lot on that. We've been focusing a lot on communication. We communicate, that our principle has been over communication. Try to talk to our people as much as possible. Try to keep them, keep their spirits up. And similarly, we've been doing the same with our customers as well, right? So we consider, we look at all of our stakeholders and we're thinking about how do we ensure that we engage with them in a fruitful manner so that these relationships last and are, have actually a meaningful time and an enriched sort of time, even though we can't see each other's faces. And so we've been focusing a lot on that. And then we've been also focusing a lot on sort of, taking some of these ideas that we've had of our own, we've actually in the last few months, we have been doing a lot of work in terms of visioning, like what is it that is sort of the ultimate goal for Tamara, where are we going? And then really breaking that down into thinking about what it is we can do now to ensure that we get to that place. So it's been an incredibly busy time, I would say. We've been focusing a lot on training as well. I mean, there's so much that we're doing that I do actually feel like in a funny way, it's a bit of a blessing that we do have this time because we're actually getting so much done. At the same time, mental and physical health is something that we are really trying to keep up, and therefore I think, you have to it's like you have to take a little dose of reality and say that, hey, listen, business does not exist. The future is uncertain, with a little bit of sweetness as well, saying like, hey, look, actually, we're so productive right now. We're actually getting a lot done. And actually, like for us, work from home, hospitality, work from home was sort of this impossible thing, right? It has never been thought of, or, it could never be possible. That was the impression that everybody had. And now we're actually able to show that, hey, look, we're actually really productive at home. And so that's also sort of a positive thing that's come out of this. So in that way, I think, it's a little bit of perspective, and us, at Tamara, we're really trying to stay positive about the future, and there's a lot of planning which is going into that right now.
Thank you for sharing that, Shruti. I think I agree with you, and I think a lot of impossibilities that we had in mind with respect to this situation, like working from home, or having time to do a lot of things that we had kept on the back burner. I think that's something that we have started doing as well. I think I can speak for everyone here on this call, at least, who's attending this webinar, that I think it's given us that kind of time to, I think, step back and vision for the future itself. And so moving on, some of our participants here had put in a few questions right before this webinar. And one of those questions is, that they would like to know what an organization should adapt to in the current scenario that we are in. What are the things that they should embrace when they're here?
Yeah, so I think, we're essentially, the topic for this entire conversation, this webinar today, is strategy, right? And I think that strategy requires you to really think at a very high level. It forces you to sort of think about scenario planning. It forces you to think about, okay, if this happens, that will happen. If this happens, we have to do this, da, 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 da. And you kind of have to think about the entire holistic sort of environment, right? So in my case, what we have to do often is really think about what are the things that we control and what are the things that we don't control. And at least what we control, we can actually change, right? In order to ensure that we can succeed in sort of what I've been calling as like the new reality. And what I mean by that is that, I think very similar. I run a business in hospitality. I know it's probably very different from what most of you all are doing. But, in essence, there is there's a customer in our case who's like a stakeholder, who's a receiving stakeholder, and then there is a business or a nonprofit or an entrepreneur who's giving a service or a product or something like that. Now, in our situation, what we believe is that guests who are our customer are going to dramatically change. The way that their preferences will change, the way that they travel will change, the things that they hold most important to them will change. And other stakeholders will change as well. Like government will change, the way that government holds restrictions in terms of how travel will happen, when it will happen. There's so many things which are going to change, and these things are completely out of our control. Tamara is a very small sort of entity in a very large picture, and I think that it doesn't make sense for us to kind of dwell on those things that we cannot control. We kind of have to just say that, okay, listen, this is the new reality. We have to take what we have and try to adapt it to that new reality so that it remains relevant, right? So that is what a lot of our focus is going in on. So we're trying to predict, okay, this is what's going to be important. This is what's going to be important to the guest, and this is why they're going to travel, why they're going to want to come to a property such as ours, why they want to go to a destination like where we are located, right? So we consider all of those sort of external factors that we don't control, and then we see how do we make ourselves relevant to that, right? So if one of the things which is we are predicting when it comes to travel, for instance, is that people will no longer want to fly or take public transportation for quite some time. We feel that for the next 6 months to possibly a year, when hopefully a vaccine is distributed, we feel that people will far prefer to go by private transportation to wherever they want to go. So in the case of some of us who are Bangaloreans, for instance, we will think about traveling to maybe Nandi Hills. We'll think about traveling to maybe Coorg. We'll think about traveling to places which are 5 hours outside of the city. So what does that mean for a business, right? When you think about those external factors, we are coming up with ideas, packages for our guests, which make it far easier for them to do that travel by private transportation. So what I mean by that is we will, for instance, we'll come out with a package to our guests, which will have a car and a driver included in that. So they're not forced to look for an option to take public transportation in any way. It also means that all of our marketing efforts, instead of us sort of spreading it very wide across the country, we often, Tamara, actually, we market a lot to Bombay, Ahmedabad, Delhi, these places. We know for a fact that those people are not going to be traveling to us for the next couple of months, because of this whole thing on public transportation. So we're mainly focusing our efforts on Bangalore, where we know that there's a bit of, there's a far higher chance that people will want to travel to that destination in Coorg. So I think that, for all of you, what I would recommend is that really, don't dwell on sort of these external factors. There's so much in the external factors that you cannot control. And that is sort of the new reality, right? And I think organizations that are able to adapt and consider that new reality analytically and with some amount of clarity, those are the ones which will be able to also adapt to that change, like adapt their sort of businesses or their services to that new reality, and then execute on that new strategy. All of us have to change. I think it's, in a crisis like this, I don't think any single one of us can sort of stay stuck and do what we were doing previously, right? I think you have to re-examine your entire operation. And I believe this is probably affecting many of you as well in the education space. And therefore, that mindset of saying that, hey, listen, I'm going to focus on what I can control. That's where I'm going to put my energy. And what can I do to adapt to the new reality? I mean, that's what you can do. And that's that strategy, essentially. I mean, thinking about, okay, these are the factors around me. How am I going to attack, in a sense, right? So yeah, that would be, that's my advice on how organizations could adapt.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think you said it, we have to change, we have to get unstuck. And this very fact brings me to my next question as to how can we get rid of predefined strategies that we hold so close to our operations, In fact, you have been cited to mention a particular concept called the Napoleon's glance. So what is that all about and how does that fit in over here?
Yeah, so actually I have to say that when I was younger, I started my first business when I was 23 and I'm 35 now. And so I've been an entrepreneur for, 12 years or so. And I have to say that when I was younger, I was actually far less amenable to change as I am now. I think when I was 23, 25, I think I was very stuck. And, I believed that there was a way of doing things. And if you did it that way, that would work. And, if I tried it some other way, then either the risk of it going badly was too much for me, or I may not have even had the guts to kind of go against the grain. And so I've learned over time, and I think I've learned from experience that, there is a place for instinct, and there is a place, there is a space for change. And what is that saying about how change is the one constant thing that you can always depend on happening? I mean, you have to change, right? I think we all have to change constantly. And and I think with experience, I've gotten far more comfortable with allowing myself to change, allowing my organization to change, allowing for experimentation. That's been one of the big things that I have been pushing from myself and from my team. I think that once you kind of get past that hurdle of being stuck, right, to what you believe is the one way of doing something, you can actually experiment in so many different ways, and the kinds of things that you discover from those experiments is incredible. And that's been my experience over the last few years. Coming to Napoleon's glance. So Napoleon's glance was actually, it was part of a course that I took in business school. And the idea was based off of how Napoleon conquered the region in Europe and into Russia and things like that. And so the idea there is that you think about, Napoleon, he was going after the win in the sense that he wanted that whole region, right? He wanted to be like this incredible conqueror. But the way he did it was really interesting. See, typically in the past, what great generals had done was that they would go into these massive battles where they were facing off these really big enemies, and the cost associated with that and the likelihood of coming out successful in that were both a little bit dicey. And Napoleon had a fairly small army, but he still had the ambition, right? So, and he had an end goal in mind. So what he did is actually he would go after these smaller sort of areas where there were smaller armies parked. And so he would win smaller battles with his little army. He would go after them and he would win these smaller battles in sort of random little places, And in that way, he was actually able to make progress in a much more effective way than fighting these big, big wars. And so the way that you apply that in your life is essentially this. You think about what it is that you want to ultimately achieve, right? Many of us, and I sometimes get stuck in this, is, we think about, we have these big dreams, but we don't necessarily really drill down into what it takes to make those dreams possible, right? So for instance, if let's say, I remember the story that I heard in the class about this woman who wanted to be a judge at the Olympics in gymnastics, for instance. And how do you do that? Like, this woman had, I think she had done gymnastics till she was like 8 years old or something, but she had this dream. I want to be a judge at the Olympics. Like, this has to happen. So what she did is she researched who are the current judges in the Olympics who are judging gymnastics. And she found out who those people were. And then she's traced their history back. And it turns out that those judges all started by judging these small town gymnastics meets. And so, and then from there, so they would do like the regional town, the competition. There would be a small judge there. Then they would somehow become a judge at the state competition, then at the national competition, and then finally they would get to the Olympics. And it was like, an 8-10 year journey to get there. And so that's what she did. She decided, okay, well, the first step is, let me just become a judge at, my local gymnastics gym. And let's see what happens, right? And so what she did is she laid out each of the steps that it took her to get there into small, doable things, right? So once she had done the first step, then the second step opened up for her, and then the third step, and then the fourth step, and then finally her goal. So, for each of us, we can certainly do that, right? And it's not even just applicable to your professional life. It's also applicable to your personal life, right? So like, for instance, let's say, for myself, this is just an example. I haven't even ever thought about this, but like, let's say one of my goals is I'm going to give a TED talk at IIT or something, like, one of the very good TED talks or something like that. How do I do that, right? And I break it down into saying, okay, over the next 3 years, these are the small things that I need to do. I have to do a webinar for mantra. That's my first step. Then the next one is I have to do let's say a TED talk at one of the local communities, like one of the local smaller colleges or something like that. And then I build myself up and up and up. And so if you write that down and you just say like, okay, these are the small steps that I take, which are doable, then it leads you to your ultimate goal. And that's the whole idea behind Napoleon's Plans, sort of breaking down your larger dreams into very doable pieces, as opposed to thinking about it and getting overwhelmed and letting it be sort of this, up in the sky sort of an idea, creating those steps that ladder to your ultimate goal. And that's something I try to do. It helps me in a lot of ways, actually, because it makes things much more concrete, right, in terms of how I live my life and sort of the way that I try to do my achievements, as such, what I am going for at any given time. So it's a very useful tool. There are books about this. My professor's name was William Duggan, and he has written about it. So if anybody's more interested in it, I very much recommend that you look up his literature.
Definitely a very intriguing concept, Shruti. We would love to know more about it. I would also like to ask you that while we are definitely still adapting to the present situation that we are in, we also can't ignore the fact that there is going to be a shift in what we see ourselves, in where we see ourselves today. Going beyond COVID, going beyond this situation that we are in, how can we re-strategize to be able to adapt better to the future?
Yeah, so one of the, like I was saying at the beginning, like somehow if you can see the positivity in the crisis, then that's an amazing perspective to have, because that means that you've actually been given this sort of blessing of possibly time and of and space, really, to get some of the things that you wanted to get done for your organization. So like, for instance, in Tamara, we have this sort of dream that we will be an institution that lasts for 100 years or 150 years, and for that, there's a lot of things that you have to do, and those are things which have to be done regardless of the crisis, what's going on outside, regardless of the fear that I may lose some of my best people after this, and regardless of, I don't know, there's so many ifs and buts, right, as to what could happen after this. But, that dream that says that, hey, look, I want to be here. I want Tamara to be here as an institution, as one of the greats after 100 years. like that lives on, right? Regardless of what happens in these crises. And if you look in the past as well, like if you think about some of the greatest institutions of our country and our world, they have already been through crises. They've come out of it and they've remained institutions. And so similarly, I think, I've been trying to focus on a lot on, so what are the things that we can do which will create sort of the foundation for that longevity. And it has nothing to do with a crisis, right? It's as simple as, I want my organization to have an HR manual. So I've asked for that to get done. I'm working on that. I want my organizational to go paperless, like I was telling you earlier. And so we've been able to do that. And that's something which is there for the future. One of the greatest things that you can do right now is consider how technology may play a part in your organization, and really reevaluating what technology looks like in your organization. I think that there is a very real possibility that crises like these will continue to happen over the years. I mean, there's a very, very, very high chance that we will go into a second lockdown once sort of some of the current restrictions are lifted. And if that's the case, I mean, the world cannot continue to sort of grind to a stop, right? We cannot just stop. And, we have to survive, all of us. And so one of the tools that we all have, that we have, some access to, is technology, right? And so please think about how are you going to use technology for your future? How are you going to deliver some of the services that you may want to in the future, even, with sort of given that, hey, listen, there are so many other things that could happen in the environment. I actually last night had a conversation with somebody from my old college in the US. I went to Haverford College. It's a very small liberal arts institution. It's 1,200 people. And it's actually a very strong college, but because it's so small, it has its challenges, right? What I mean by that is, larger institutions have larger alumni bases who give larger donations, and smaller colleges do not. And so, a lot of these small colleges are really suffering. And so they're literally, when I was talking to her about some of the challenges and some of the things that they're trying to do now that sort of this has happened. And one of the things they were talking about was literally redoing the entire academic calendar cycle. And this is something which has probably been part of education for hundreds of years, right? The way that American education is that college education, you come in September and you leave in December, you have a week off in the middle. Again, you take a month off, you come back in January, you finish in May, and you take a week off in the middle. And for a lot of students, that's very, very difficult to do, because you have students from varying different backgrounds. And for a lot of the students who cannot afford to go home for that 1 week in the middle or that 1 month in the middle, it's a pretty distressing sort of a thing, right? Your college is taking you out in the middle of the semester, things like that. And so it's, they're actually re-looking entirely at this very fundamental part of education, which is the academic calendar. And they're rethinking how do they deliver what they deliver, which is, a very high quality education, college education. And how do they do that in a better way, which makes sense for all of the students, right? Regardless of your economic background, regardless of whether or not you are international or you are from the region, and they're trying to figure out how it is that, for instance, like, could education be sort of a combo of online and offline training, so that the time that the students actually spend on campus is a far more enriching time, but they actually also have some of that which is done from home. So it's really interesting to hear how organizations are leveraging this time to think about so deeply, like, into some of these fundamental assumptions that we have of what it is to be us. And I mean, the same thing is going on in hospitality. I think the hospitality industry is really re-examining what hospitality means, right? And how do what is the relevance? Like, why do people pay us what they do, right? To come and stay in one of our properties? Like, are we giving true value, or are we giving what the customer wants? I mean, all of these sort of fundamental questions of how do we run, how do we exist, this is a good time to ask those questions of yourselves and see, is there something like, really fundamental about what I'm doing that could be changed? It's a scary thing to ask yourself, I have to say, because it really does, you may have to sort of reimagine your entire history and break it down and, and think about some of the mistakes that you've made. But it's incredibly invaluable, and it may set you up to be far stronger for the future. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you, Shruti, for sharing. I think what really enriches it is with you sharing your personal anecdotes as well. And I think we have a lot to take away from that, along with everything else that we're trying to seek. So I would like to inform all of the participants that if there are any questions that you have for Shruti, you can put them in the chat box. We will ask these questions to Shruti. Shruti, I would like to bring you to another point, that you are a firm believer of responsible and sustainable interventions. And perhaps with changing times, it is worth for all of us to also understand what some common mistakes are that we can make while we strategize for our organizations and interventions. And I'm asking this to you in your capacity of having worked with a lot of organizations in the development sector itself. So how can we avoid these mistakes? What are these mistakes and how can we avoid them?
Yeah, so I've been extremely lucky to be exposed to a number of different types of organizations and nonprofits, actually, over the last 10, 15 years. I used to serve on the board of my college a number of years ago. I currently am on I am a trustee of two of my family foundations. I'm also a trustee to an organization called the Women's Education Project. I've spoken to, people at Mantra, Regimentum, and other organizations as well. And, I've seen a bit of what can happen in, what are some of the mistakes that can happen in corporate structures and in corporate organizations, as well as in nonprofit organizations. And one of the things that I have to say that, is a very common mistake, and it often happens in corporate as well, but more so in nonprofits, is, one of the mistakes that I see, that there's often not enough strong financial management. And what I mean by that is that, we all, especially in the nonprofits, there's always a great cause, right? I mean, you are all working towards fantastic, important causes. But for that work to be done, you need to have money so that it can effectively be done. So one of the things, and we actually see this often in startups as well, is that, you need to think about, where are you spending your money, right? Every single paisa which goes out from your bank account as an organization, is it going towards helping you achieve your goal? Is it really impacting, the cause that you're going after? At the same time, when you're considering where that money is coming from, it's incredibly important for you to analyze the risk associated with it. And what I mean by that is, if, for instance, if you are purely running on contributions, it is very, very important that you consider that a portion of your contributions comes from corporate sponsors. Another portion of it has to also come from individual sponsors or smaller sponsors. And the reason I say that is because corporate sponsorship is extremely risky. Like, for instance, for the next year, I think corporates are going to be extremely strapped on cash, and they may not hold up to the commitments that they are making to many of our nonprofits. And that will, that happens. I mean, and with every economic cycle, you'll see that happening. Every couple of years, you will have corporates, not unable to make these payments. And of course, like individual corporates, if they are large contributors to you, you have to consider, if that one organization goes down, are you still able to survive? I mean, these are very fundamental questions that require, it's sometimes uncomfortable to think about, but it is extremely important for everybody to have that diversity in contributions, because you need to be able to manage the risk of, if something goes wrong, we will still be able to survive as an organization. So that's one part. The other thing that I think that I see is a common mistake is the inability for some to make revenue-based decisions. And I don't know, I'm hoping this comes out in the right way. But what I mean by that is, I think most nonprofit organizations are always, again, they're driven by this greater cause, right? But in order to survive, you must have some stability in terms of your cash flow. And this goes back to saying, okay, yes, you will have a certain set of contributors, but is there some way for you to make revenue? Because if there is something that you were able to offer as a service or as a product into the market, and you're actually able to make some money off of that, that is that's a very good way to survive, right? I mean, that's how businesses survive. They have very clear targets, revenue goals, profitability, which sort of drives them to growth, drives them to organizational sustainability. And I don't see enough nonprofits exploring those options. I think organizations have to consider, listen, in order, I know this deviates from my cause, my greater cause, but for the good of the survival of the organization, I will take on this job with the resources that I have, so that we can have some revenue which comes in, which makes us less dependent on philanthropy. And I think that's something which really can be explored more. And I think, given that you are all social entrepreneurs, I think that's something that you really need to think about. Is there some way in which that you can actually create cash flow for your organization which is not dependent on philanthropy? Because philanthropy is it's so market driven, and you may be putting all your eggs in one basket when you really need to spread it out and sort of minimize your risk in that way. I had one more point and it is slipping my mind. If you give me a second, I'll think about it. But yeah, I think financial acumen is something that I think all organizations need to consider, and it's something you'll never regret it. Learning more about finances, how to manage your finances, how to ensure organizational sustainability. That's something that I think can never be. It's a great skill to have. Just thinking, what was my last point? I had one more point on this. Anyways, all right. If I remember, I'll come back to it.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shruti, for answering that. I think I would also like to add here that you have been talking a little bit about the whole agility aspect, and being open to new opportunities and to be able to pivot. What's your take on that aspect as well, as a quality that social entrepreneurs need to have in order to be able to, survive uncertainties?
Yeah, I mean, it's, it is, I mean, agility and adaptability will always serve you well. I think that, these are qualities which are incredibly useful for your longevity. I think along with that, though, there needs to be something which is that, ultimately, though, I think you need to be very true to your values, right? I think that's something that I've grown up with, and it's something that I find is very, very important to me, is that, listen, I will adapt, I will change, but I will not compromise on my values. So if there is, in Tamara, one of the things that we focus on very, very much is compliance. And it sounds really dry. It's, essentially, it's government compliance, right? I mean, we ensure that we have all of our approvals. We don't do anything if we don't have those approvals in place. We make sure that we are keeping track of everything which is needed for keeping track of. And it sounds so incredibly dry, but there is a fundamental reason that we do this, and that is that we have a value which is very deeply ingrained in us, which is we call it fairness to all stakeholders, and that includes being fair to the government. So if we feel that, if we say that, listen, we're going to ensure that we have this approval, for instance, one of the big licenses that we have to get is a liquor license, for instance, for serving alcohol. If we say, listen, as a organization, we're going to be fair to the government and we're not going to serve alcohol, even though we will get something out of it if we did. We're not going to do it because we don't have our approval in hand. That's very fundamental. I mean, that's a decision which goes against business, technically, right? Because I could have had potential business by, serving to whomever, but it doesn't compromise by saying that we won't serve without an approval, the proper license. We're saying that we won't break that fundamental value that we hold so very truly to ourselves. And that's the thing with change, right? I think that you have to think about how much are you willing to change and what are the steps that you're willing to take, but also what are you willing not to do? And I think it is hard, and a lot of these decisions can often be hard. I think it's very easy to fall into traps when you're stressed, especially where you compromise on your values. But if you do that, the repercussions of that are very, very high. The price of that is very, very high. You stand to take on unnecessary risk for yourself and your organization. You stand to lose respect. And those are things that you may not want for yourself. And so adaptability is extremely important, but it has to go hand in hand with saying, this is what I will not do. I actually wanted to go back to the previous question. And one of the things I also wanted to mention about the previous point that we were talking about, I just remembered, was this, about mistakes. One of the other things that I have been hearing a lot about and witnessing a bit of is, especially in nonprofits and with social entrepreneurs, I find that people tend to get burnt out because they are so very focused on their cause. And I'm sure many of you may have experienced this to some extent or the other, right? Especially in nonprofits, you see that, there's this important cause that you're all working towards. And I think for many of you, that is education and some aspect of education. But, how much are you personally willing to sacrifice for that cause? That's something that you need to consider very strongly, because there is a tendency, and there's actually scientific research on this that I've seen, there is a tendency for people in nonprofits to burn out because they don't focus on themselves. They're so focused on their cause that their personal life, their mental health, their physical health, all of that suffers. And that means that you burn out and you can't actually work towards your cause for more than a certain period of time. And so that's the other sort of thing that I warn all of you to please watch out for. Please take care of yourselves, especially in stressful times like this. I mean, there is nothing more important than health, obviously, and we've seen that now. But, physical health is one aspect of it. Mental health is really equally important. And it is important that, especially when you are not thinking of yourselves most of the time, that you do take a moment to consider what your work is doing to you and how you can possibly bring more balance to it so that you don't necessarily ignore yourself in that whole equation, because your work is so important, and we need all the country, the world, we need you to continue your work. And for that, we need you to stay and keep working. And so please watch out for yourselves. Don't make that mistake that so many do of burning out.
Great insights, Shruti. I think it's a very hopeful note that you're leaving us on. And I think with that, I would like to take one question from the audience. Mr. Raghavendra has posted this question, that startups are always pressed for cash. And while we also know that 1 out of 10 startups could only succeed, do you think that that equation will also change going forward?
So I have a problem with how startups receive funding. And this is, this is going back to like the fundamentals of it, right? I think that especially these days, so much of funding is coming from venture capitalists and private equity. And the way that startups are incentivized to succeed is misaligned with how organizations are supposed to be built. And what I mean by that is that, VCs, they put so much pressure on these startups for them to succeed in the first 6 months, in the first year, that, the startups ending up putting so much pressure on themselves, they burn through that cash. And they find out that they're not able to scale in any sort of an organic way, and that they're not capable to do it, or they're not equipped to do it. They don't have the right people, they don't have the right resources, whatever it is, or they've made bad decisions. They've just, I think that is, that's really why that number is so low. That 1 out of 10. I think if you had somewhat more understanding investors who had a longer term perspective, you may actually see some of these startups doing far better. At the same time, I do believe that, good ideas only do so much. It all sort of success lies in execution. And I'm not sure exactly how many, like out of the 9 of 10 that didn't succeed, how many of those are good at execution. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that, yeah, the numbers could be better if investors had that longer term perspective. Having said that, I don't know if that situation is going to get any better. I would love for that to change. I would love for investors to have, to not put that kind of pressure and stress on startups so that they burn through all their cash so quickly and that they're forced into sort of these positions that don't make sense. But I would love for that to happen, but I'm not sure that that's going to change anytime soon. I do think, when we have been thinking about our guests in Tamara, one of the things that we've been saying is that people will want to travel to destinations and hotels which are more responsible, more sustainable. They'll care more about the impact of their travel, and they'll care more about what is the organization that I'm associated with doing to help the situation, the environment, the community, whatever it is. That's a belief that I have fundamentally about people. I think people will care more now, and but I'm not sure if that will translate into the VCs. From what I've seen of VCs, that it'll be difficult to change that that sort of an environment and that culture. But maybe, who knows? I hope it does. It would be great if it did change.
Thank you, Shruti. I'm getting another question here. You spoke about staying true to one's values, but values are often at conflict with each other, especially for founders. Did you face any value conflict? How did you handle it? And do you have any suggestions or learnings or reflections that you would like to share with this group?
Sure. So, value conflicts are, thankfully they don't come around too often, but yeah, it comes around. See, I actually, so I don't come from a hospitality background, and, I came into it in a kind of a funny way. And so but I'd never studied hospitality. And I didn't sort of work through the ranks of, starting as a waiter and then, coming to senior levels. I didn't do that. I came into it with a very different perspective. I came into it with a business perspective, with, somewhat of a financial background and a bit of a science background, because I actually studied chemistry. And so I came with a very analytical background, as opposed to sort of, having gone through the industry. The industry sometimes I have value conflict with, I have to say. And it's often because that the industry sort of places importance, or actually doesn't place importance on what I think is extremely important, which is its people. Hospitality actually is it's the largest employer within the organized sector, and we contribute to 9% of the GDP in India. So it's a huge impact that the industry has on the people of the country and on the economy of the country. And one of the things, and this is somewhat universal across the industry, is that one of the things that we've also seen is that the industry has quite a lot of attrition. And what that means is that oftentimes people will come into the industry very young, and they will not stay with you. They will continue to circulate, right? So they will jump from one company to the next, they'll only say maybe 3 months or 6 months. And it's very, very common to see. And because of that, the industry actually refuses to invest in its people in that segment. They don't invest in training. They don't invest in getting them good health care, investing in good health insurance schemes, giving them, fair wages, things like that. And that's something that I fundamentally have problems with. I don't believe that any job should be without respect, without dignity. I think that every job commands, minimum pay. I believe that as an organization, your success is dependent on your people, and you have to invest in them in order for the success of your business. And that is, it's a fundamental value of mine and of the organization to say that, hey, listen, our people are our greatest assets, and whatever come may, we're going to invest in them. So if it's training, if it is fairer wages, if it's ensuring that, for instance, most of our employees, 99% of our employees, actually all of our employees, they are all full-time employees. We don't take contractual staff, which is very much against most of the industry. And the reason we do that is because we believe that every single employee within the organization should have health insurance. And, that's something that we ensure happens. And so when people have entered my organization from outside of this culture, from sort of the typical hospitality culture, there's a lot of questioning. And there's sometimes, people who try very hard to go against it. And, to be honest, they don't survive long. Because, as long as we hold very true to it and we say, hey, listen, this is what it takes to be an institution to survive 100 years. This is what it takes. And this is the kind of organization we want to be. Then they can't survive in our environment. They won't be able to change us, right? If we're not able to change them, then it's not a right fit. It doesn't happen too often, but we do see these types of value conflicts coming up. It happens, in the industry with people from outside of the organization that I've seen who have entered into Tamara. It also, like I was saying, this whole thing on government compliance is a big one. In India, Indians have sort of, we look for the loophole, we look for the jugaad to get ourselves out of sometimes, paying for these different things and, whatever is associated with government. And in Tamara, we say the opposite. We are saying that, hey, listen, we have to be fair, we have to be responsible, we're going to do this the right way. And, that's what it takes. And so, yeah, it happens once in a while.
Thank you, Shruti. I think we have time for one more question since we're a little crunched for time. I'm sorry, let me just scroll down to this. What sets your hospitality venture apart in this vast competitive market? And I'm going to combine that with another question where he asks if COVID has an effect on the commercial real estate in India in short term and in long term, and how long will they take to recover?
Okay, so I can say a little bit to what sort of sets Tamara apart in the market. So we focus very much on experiences, and that's a little bit different from what hotel companies used to do in the past. And what I mean by that is when you think of hotels in the past, in the 80s and the 90s, people used to travel for necessity, and they would travel for the fancy hotel rooms. They would travel for, very nice amenities and things like that. Like the building was very important, and the people had to be servile. And what I mean that people were not sort of held at the same level as the guests. The respect that was given to staff in a hotel was probably much lower than the kind of respect that were given to guests. And I think that a lot of that has changed. And I think that customers have changed, right? Customers have become more worldly. Now you can discover brands online. You're not sort of, brands are not restricted by their marketing budgets to put out these huge billboards and advertisements and things like that to get the word out that they exist. And so, the whole sort of the ecosystem has changed. And what that means is that Then also what we find is that guests are now looking for experiences, holistic experiences. So when somebody travels, they want to learn something new, or they want to experience something which they don't usually get at home. And so something that sets us apart, and this mostly is as part of our resorts, is that we try to really focus on being of the community in which we exist, right? So if I have a resort in Kodaikanal, then that property is not something that you can just take, like, the building, you can't just take it, lift it, and put it somewhere else, because what makes that property what it is the experience of the experience of what a guest would feel when they come to that property. What are the kinds of experiences that they're having in Kodaikanal along with us? The treks that they're having, the cheese making that they can do, the honey that they can collect, the boating that they can do, like all of these things, that whole experience of how do you engage with the people and the property, all of that has really changed. And so that's what we focus on. We focus on experiences. We actually run different types of brands. We run resorts, we run business hotels, we run mid-segment hotels as well. And we really look at the entire experience. We don't just say, like, listen, here's a building and here's the service. Like, it's not that flat. It's a far more holistic approach to hospitality. And I think that sets us apart, along with this, the approach that we take, which is the responsible hospitality, which has to do with essentially the triple bottom line, which is people, profit, and planet. And we consider very greatly our impact on these, on our environment, on our community, and our business. So that's what I would say sets us apart. The second part of this question was, how long do I think it's going to take to recover? I've been hearing about this. I've been reading about it. I don't think anybody knows. I think that it's, I'm very hopeful. I'm generally an optimist. And so I hope that there is recovery, in terms of like long-term recovery. I'm hoping that it comes sooner rather than later, but I have to be honest, I don't think there's going to be any genuine recovery for 18 months. I think it's wise to be very, very prudent with the expenses that you have and with sort of the, whatever you're doing for the next 18 months. I think it's going to be very volatile in every way, in your operations, in real estate prices, everything. I think it's going to be really dicey. Having said that, I have been hearing that, given that economic, a lot of people will be shying away from China over the next couple of years, that means that's, that it's in India's benefit in a sense. And a lot of the manufacturing, for instance, that was going to China will maybe come to India. And that means that India is going to have tremendous growth over the next couple of years. And so the prediction has been that 2024, I think, will be, a real high for the country. And I'm very much hoping for that. But at the same time, I think, it's very foggy out there. I have no idea. I really don't. I'm hoping it's not too long, but I think real recovery will take 18 months, and that's how my business is planning for it. We don't think that it will happen in the next year at all.
Thank you for taking those questions as well, Shruti. I think we're at the end of our 1 hour interaction, and I honestly think that 1 hour is not enough to soak up all of your experiences and everything all of your insights that you have to give us. On that note, I would like to thank each one of you participants for joining us today and engaging with Shruti. Any last, closing remarks that you would like to give to all of us?
Just best of luck. I think, try your best to find the positive in this situation, and all the best. I really hope. I know that this is such a wonderful group of people, and there's so much good that you're all doing in the world, and you will continue to do that, right? The causes that you are working on, they're not going to disappear overnight, and I think the work that you're doing is invaluable. And so please try to stay positive. Please try to take care of yourselves, and do remember that this will end. This is a temporary situation, and try to make the best out of it as much as possible. And thank you so much. Thanks so much to all of you for for coming in and listening to me on this Friday evening.